please take your seats? We will be starting very soon. Please settle in and take your seats.
For sticking with us. Appreciate it. To talk about the Arctic. I'm Jeanne Meserve. I'm a member of the Homeland Security Experts Group and the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. And we are here, obviously, to talk about the Arctic, which historically has been viewed as a place where we have international cooperation and coordination. But the climate is changing, both literally and figuratively. Right now, in Canadian Arctic, they are having a record heat wave. And as the ice is melting, there are new opportunities for exploration and for exploitation. And a new actor has entered the stage, that is China. And so increasingly, in addition to talking about coordination with one another, there is talk of competition, and there is even talk of conflict politically, economically, and even militarily. We've assembled a great panel here today to talk about these issues. Let me quickly introduce them. Sitting to my right is Matti Anttonen. Did I say it correctly? All right. Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of Finland. Next to him is Sherri Goodman. Sherri is a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, followed by Admiral Karl Schultz, who is Commandant of the United States Coast Guard. And finally, we have at the end Elizabeth Economy. Elizabeth is the CV Starr Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, all of us, for being here. Admiral, I'd like to start with you. Do a little ground setting here.
Okay.
How many icebreakers does Russia have?
A lot. Next question. No, Russia has dozens of icebreakers, Jeanne, and you know, and they're building. They got 9 or 10 nuclear. They're continuing to build breakers. I think the Russian worldview is very much based on the Arctic. Here in the United States, we think about the Arctic as a faraway place, and they're deriving about 22% of their economy from the Arctic.
So they have about 20 or so?
They have about large, probably in the dozens, 20 to 30, and then they got some smaller breakers. So I would say numerically, probably in the 40s, you know, if you, what we call big ocean-going breakers, probably 24 plus.
How many icebreakers does China have?
China has 2. They just launched the Snow Dragon #2, first domestically built, and they're talking about building a heavy nuclear power breaker in the immediate future.
And they have plans for many more, correct?
Plans for many more.
How many icebreakers does the United States have?
So the United States the United States Coast Guard, who has all the icebreakers. We have 2. We have a 40-plus-year-old heavy icebreaker, the Polar Starr, who makes 1 trip a year down to McMurdo, and she's on life support for the next few years till we build the first replacement. Then we have a medium breaker that was built 20-plus years ago, the Healy, which is getting ready to head up to the Arctic for some research for the next 3-4 months.
Now, I know from my work as a reporter that the Coast Guard has been aware of the deterioration of its breaker force for a very long time, and you have had trouble getting funding from the U.S. Congress to build new breakers. There's one in production now, however.
Correct. We just got awarded a contract recently.
And it's not going to hit water till when?
2024, possibly 2023 with some incentives to ship it.
Which is a long way away.
It's a ways down the road, yes, ma'am.
So right now, could the United States defend its interests or assert its power north of the Arctic Circle?
Well, the phrase I've coined in my first year is I talk about presence equals influence. And if you're not there, you're not there. I mean, in the Arctic, as we've been focused most recently off Alaska, you know, China's been up there 6 of the last 7, 8, 9 years. So I think we're getting beat in that game. China will outbuild us in the shipbuilding, but you know, you got the numbers a minute ago, Jeanne. By 2025, they're the most prolific shipbuilder in the world. They'll probably have more capacity and capability than we will.
China isn't the only player there. Russia, of course, another major power in the Arctic. You live right next door. You have been Finland's ambassador to Moscow. What are they doing militarily in the Arctic?
I think we should kind of, as was mentioned, start with the fact that the Arctic is really important for Russia. 45% of the Arctic coastline is Russian. 80% of Russian gas, and Russia is a major gas and oil exporter, comes from the Arctic. Their major military bases are there, Murmansk.
And they're building new ones, aren't they?
They are building new ones, but I think the really big thing is that all their nuclear ballistic missile armed submarines are based in the Arctic region, either in the Pacific side or then on the European side. So Arctic is really much more important for Russia than for many other players.
You live next door. Are you concerned about what you see the Russians doing, or the Chinese for that matter?
I think the Chinese presence in Arctic is rather small at the moment. It will take time until they become a major player. If we start with the Chinese, I think for them, the most important thing is that when you look at their markets, United States and Europe are the two big markets for China. It's about 25% shorter, the northern route. And when this becomes available, I think it's quite natural that they will look for opportunities there. Then on Russia, we are not, as was mentioned in one of the panels today, we are not in a Cold War. Also, their capabilities are not on the same level. They have reformed their military, but still very far from the levels they had during the Cold War. So we are not worried about that. But of course, it's an area which becomes more important, and I think it's very good, like we have today. We are discussing it because it's kind of area which has been forgotten for a long time.
And it's changing. Sherri, tell us about that. I've been told that the climate is changing more radically in the Arctic than anywhere else on Earth.
Well, thank you, Jeanne. Well, let's understand why we have this emerging geopolitical competition in the Arctic. It's because the climate is changing more rapidly in that region than anywhere else on Earth. It's warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet. The sea ice is melting. So that shipping lanes are becoming increasingly open. The permafrost is collapsing, affecting both indigenous communities, road infrastructure, and even sometimes our military base infrastructure. Sea level rise from the melting ice sheets and Alaska is contributing globally. 60% of global sea level rise is because of the melting in the Arctic today. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. We now see our weather in the lower 48 affected by the meandering Gulf Stream, jet stream that is producing the extreme weather events we now have regularly. And so this has, and many now see this as an opportunity. China declaring itself a near-Arctic stakeholder and seeking a polar Silk Road across the Arctic, and Russia seeking to monetize the Northern Sea Route and convert that into transit routes for it in the future. So we not only, as Joe Nye said, we have to be able to walk and chew gum. We have to be able to address both the emerging competition and recognize the climate forcing factors, the threat multiplier in this region.
Liz Economy, the real new factor here, in addition to climate change, is the Chinese. That's your area of expertise. This declaration that they are a near Arctic state, even though they're, 900 miles to the south of the Arctic Circle? What is their aim here?
Yeah, so I think we should clarify the fact that actually China has been engaged in the Arctic for about 20 years. They've been doing scientific expeditions. They've had 7 or 8 over the past 20 years.
But this isn't about
new.
science.
Right, this is new, and I think China's sort of thinking about the Arctic kind of tracks its global ambitions. So in the beginning, it was mostly about science, but it has expanded. And it's expanded even past the point of being what they call a near polar power or a near Arctic power, to Xi Jinping saying,
excuse me.
That's okay.
Oh my goodness, a little drama.
Saying
Global warming right here, water on the floor, sorry.
That's okay. Saying that Xi Jinping saying in 2014 that he wants China to become a great polar power. So I probably would take a slightly different tack than Secretary Matti and say that I think China's objective is no less than to transform Arctic governance, actually. So I think China, if you look at what they're doing, it is. But I think if you look at what China's very patient, and they tend to approach things incrementally. And if you look, I think there's sort of three parts, if I can, three parts to their strategy. The first is really a reframing of the Arctic issue, right? To talk about what Sherri's mentioned, sort of the climate change. Climate change, as they put it, right, is changing the very nature of the Arctic. Pushing it beyond the interests of what they call the inter-Arctic states, right? Those that are members of the Arctic Council, requiring the participation of a greater group of global players, including China, right? They talk about the opportunity of cooperation around the Arctic is expanding continuously. These are all ways of saying that Arctic governance has to change in order to meet the changing sort of
And we'll get a little bit more into
geography.
Arctic Council in a bit.
Right, and then there's so that's the first thing they're doing. So how do they reframe the issue? The second is what Sherri mentioned, that's the Polar Silk Road, right? And that really is bringing the Arctic under the umbrella or within the framework of a Chinese initiative, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. And so everything that you see China doing in terms of the broader Belt and Road, it's doing in the polar area, right? From the resource investments to the improved connectivity, right? The 2 new transit routes that they would like to see established, new shipping routes, to, sort of, I don't think they're in the political realm quite yet, but of the security, right? They, sought to buy a defunct U.S. military base in Greenland. Denmark pushed back. But I think we'll see all of those moves coming into play. You just have to put all the pieces of the puzzle together.
Is it just about trade routes? There are other things they're very interested in, like rare earth
Well, the
metals.
resources, right.
Yeah.
Greenland is a prime example. They have already, I think, 5 different mining efforts underway. And in partnership with Australia, they have a rare earth mining one. But China's now taking it to the next stage so that while the mining is done in conjunction with Australia, the processing will be done by the Chinese. So and they already command upwards of 90% of all the processing of rare earths. So this would be another big add to their stock.
What about fish, Admiral? That falls within the purview of the U.S. Coast Guard. As the climate warms, fish stocks are moving north. They're a valuable protein resource. Is that another thing the Chinese are after?
Absolutely. I would say today we derive about 50% of American seafood products from Alaska. And as the waters warm, those migratory species will head north. That's one piece. There's also a defense component. The Chinese, I think it's clear interest in the resource in the Arctic. There's also interest in the defense of the Arctic. We're sighting 5th-generation fighters in northern Alaska right now, and they're keenly interested in that. They're interested in locations of undersea cable. So there's the economic piece, there's the resources piece, there's a defense piece.
If I could just add on the fish, fish are increasingly the source of protein for people globally, and no one needs that protein source more than the billions of Chinese. The United States and China and other nations last year signed a moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic, which runs for 16 years. And at the same time, all those nations, including China, get to do research on what's happening in the region and understand that. And, so I have a theory that China is using that research better to observe those fish stocks migrating northward with eyes on the prize of a future fishing ground in that region.
Liz mentioned this telecom cable from Finland to China. Why is Finland engaged in this, and are you at all worried about the possible implications?
Actually, the cable project, which is just in the very early stages, it's actually from Finland, Norway, then following the northern Russian coastline to Japan. And there is one.
Is China involved in the project?
Not at the moment, because it's a kind of, the idea is the first that cable would go to Japan, and then the Japanese participants are interested, of course, then continuing that to China, because China is the big market for the information. And of course, the same thing as with other transport, that it's much shorter route to Europe, and in this sphere also the shortness makes it more profitable.
So any security concerns about it?
There are always security concerns, but there are security concerns with all the cables. Wherever they go, the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, they are all vulnerable. This is not more vulnerable than other cables which are going there in the seabed.
So, sorry, China's not in discussions with Finland about working on a cable? Was it ever in discussions?
No, this was a project where the Japanese, and of course then we need a Russian participant, because it's going through the Russian, if not the coastal waters, but at least their economic zone. So I think it would be totally impossible to think about it if there would not be a kind of Russian firm involved in this. But I mean, there are a lot of cables going through the southern route, across the Mediterranean Sea to Suez Canal, and then to India and China. So this would be just a little shortcut, but we'll see whether that will be realized, because you need quite a lot of money to make that happen.
U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo recently said this is America's moment to stand up as an Arctic nation. It's far away, it's inhospitable. Admiral, and also Sherri, you too, as a former Deputy Undersecretary, why should Americans care? Why should they make a major investment in Arctic resources?
Well, let me start with that. I would say on Secretary Pompeo, one of the things he said, which I think is a very strong statement at the ministerial in Finland, was there are Arctic states and there are non-Arctic states. There's no such thing as a near-Arctic state, and I would say I just reaffirm that. We talked a bit about China's interest in the Arctic in terms of resources, security. That should be concerning. It's a race, as they just merged their they just announced a merger of the two largest state-owned shipbuilders to focus on building Arctic-capable vessels. Those are commercial vessels. Those are icebreakers. Priority number one is icebreakers. They're building a nuclear icebreaker. There's no nuclear icebreakers in the Antarctic because of treaty agreements. So China has a manifest interest in going to the Arctic aggressively in the future. The Russian piece we talked about, Russia has a huge Arctic coastline. They have clear Arctic interests. They derive their GDP from there. From a security standpoint, and they're militarized in the Arctic, that is probably the future place for a contentious situation. We, the United States Navy, sea lines, open sea lines of communication, freedom of navigation, we've got concerns. When you see that as a fee-for-service type situation, those are the reasons we should be concerned about Russia, who is way ahead of us in the game, and this emerging aggressive China who is pushing into the game, Jeanne, from my perspective.
Do you fear another South China Sea?
Well, I think we've heard a lot of things today about competing great powers. I think the facts in the South China Sea are there were not islands, now there's islands. There was not runways, now there's runways with fighters and radars on board. I think the testimonial to that is we should be concerned about China in the Arctic because the patterns of behavior are not altruistic at all.
Sherri, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Well, we should not forget that the U.S. is an Arctic nation. We have always been an Arctic nation. And in the climate era, our part of the Arctic, which was less accessible because it was more ice covered than the high north and the Norwegian, Scandinavian part of the Arctic for many years, is now more accessible. There are parts in the Bering Strait where Alaska and Russia meet at its closest point. We are only 30 miles apart.
Is it a potential choke point?
Well, it's more a risk at this point of an accident. Of a shipping accident, or in the future, a Russian nuclear-powered icebreaker having a problem. We know that their nuclear-powered subs and ships have had challenges. China's going to be transiting energy, LNG, through that region more so in coming years. So there are scenarios that one can envision where there's an accident, and let's not forget that the communications in the polar region are very, very difficult. They're not the same as we have in the lower 48. We don't have polar orbiting satellites. The magnetic poles, fields shift up communications up there. Former Secretary of Defense Matti said we need to up our game in the Arctic. Up our game in the Arctic. And Secretary of Navy Spencer, when asked by Congress why he was deploying more naval forces there, he said, well, the damn thing melted. But we also have a saying in the Pentagon, strategy without resources is hallucination. And so while we've long invested in the subsurface and the air and space-based assets, and we are continuing to upgrade and provide those, the challenge is going to be in the surface capability, where of course the Coast Guard now is leading with building a new icebreaker, but we'll need more capability there in the future as well.
I'm sure the Commandant wants to weigh in. What if there was an accident? Are you ready to respond? Could you do it?
We've been, for the last few years, in the seasonal open seasons, June to about October. We've increased our game. We've got 4 deployed helicopters operating out of Kotzebue, people doing inspection-type activities on merchant interests up there, mariner interests, some gold operations. So we have been informing the future of the Arctic, and the future of the Arctic is today. What I would say is that, yeah, in environmental, there's cruise ships there going through now.
With a lot of people.
Expeditionary cruise ships, upwards of a couple thousand passengers. So the propensity for an environmental accident, a human accident, goes up exponentially. Our nearest air base is in Kodiak, 1,000 miles from Barrow, Utoviak, what we call it today. So that's a full tank of gas to get there many hours later. So if you're in distress in the Arctic, you may be in distress for a while. There's no organic capability. So we are building our capacity, Jeanne. Today, I would say we are definitely not where we need to be as the Arctic builds out here. And just one last thing on the communication. So I talked about the Healy, the medium research vessel going up there this summer. They'll support 3 customers, generally Office of Naval Research, Natural Science Foundation, another customer on the science front. But they'll be off the grid, 30 days. It's hard to believe in this globally connected society in 2019 that we've got a crew of vessels, shipmates out there with no connectivity. So we got to get a whole of government, partnership with industry solution to get some capacity, low Earth orbit satellite for domain awareness and for communications. We got to do that quick, Jeanne.
We also need international cooperation, right? It was
Absolutely.
mentioned by one of the earlier panels that this was a place where perhaps the US and Russia could build greater cooperation. Is that what we need, both for search and rescue, but also for military?
We have an agreement with Russia for search and rescue. We have the satellite system for mariners across the globe. It's another Mattisism, but it talks about, cooperate where we can, compete where we must. I think we absolutely need to find that common ground with our, we would like a peaceful, environmentally safe, 8 Arctic nation set in the terms of governance in the Arctic. I think that's where we'd like to be. The practical reality is it's not exactly how things are unfolding right now, Joe.
Right, and meanwhile, NATO had a major exercise.
Correct. Trident Juncture,
With
31 countries, 50,000 participants, Central, Eastern Norway. Largest exercise, I think, since the Cold War. 2015, Russia had their version. 45,000 Russians, mobilizing ships, planes, soldiers on the ground, testing logistics systems. So I think we're all sort of looking at this through the same lens.
Finland, of course, not a member of NATO, but did you participate in that exercise?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. Concerned about the Russian exercise?
As I said, we are not yet on the same level we were during the Cold War. Their kind of military capabilities, they are still not what they think they should have. The country is spending about, according to the international experts, some 4.5% of their GDP on defense. In real money, that's about 60 to 70 billion dollars. It's quite far what the US is spending at the moment. So difficult to say, of course, how much mileage they're getting with that money, but so far, I think that's kind of manageable.
So we've talked about China, we've talked about Russia, we've talked about the US. We haven't talked about Finland. Tell me about Finland's view of the Arctic and how you hope to use it.
I think that, of course, the region is important. We live there. For us, it's a reality.
Yeah. What proportion of your territory is north of the Arctic Circle?
Maybe one quarter. Not many people live there. I think the biggest concern for us is this climate change. 2012 was the year we had least ice in the north. This year we are on the same level. So we might have the record small amount of ice, surface covered by the ice. And that's not that's only part of the problem, because the ice is thinner, and the thinner the ice, the more it's likely to melt. And you know, a comparison, ice reflects about 90% of the sun radiation. Water reflects only 10%. So the more we have water in the north, the more it will suck heat from the sun. And the more, that's the reason the process is so much faster in the north. So it's extremely important that we do everything we can to fight the climate change. And we have a new government, and they have promised that Finland would be climate or carbon neutral by 2035. So we would be the first developed nation to be carbon neutral, and I actually think that's doable.
The Arctic Council tried to reach agreement on climate change. The U.S. refused to sign on to that.
Okay, I mean, that wasn't really a kind of agreement on climate change. There was
a statement.
A statement.
But even to a statement, the U.S. wouldn't sign on. Does that concern you, given your level of concern about the issue?
Of course, it concerns us because, as I said, and as was mentioned here, this is a region which is being hit hardest by the climate change. But then we have to look at the facts. It's U.S. is not or will not be part of the global deal on climate. On the other hand, this country is doing quite a lot to reduce use of coal, which is a positive thing. I think during the last few years, the use of coal has really gone down dramatically, and that continues. This country is investing in renewables, which is a good thing. So it's not just politics, but it's also the reality, and these things are decided on the company level, on the state level. Not everything is decided in Washington, D.C.
Liz, you wanted to add?
Yeah, that's a very lovely analysis. Thank you. Thank you for supporting us in that. I think the environment is a great area for cooperation, actually. And Sherri mentioned the 5+5 fisheries, or you mentioned 5+5 fisheries agreement, which is important. And climate change is another. And Secretary Pompeo, criticized China and Russia for their contributions to climate change, but obviously didn't agree to sign on to this statement. And I think for us to, and we could be doing more, in Greenland, for example, working with China on its mining efforts to ensure that they're done in the best, environmentally sustainable ways. There are lots of ways that we can seek out cooperation with the other players in the region on an issue like in the environment, but we have to be present. And so I think part of the challenge for the United States right now is, what is our affirmative strategy, right? Is it just about protecting against the encroachment or incursion of China, which I'm frankly in favor of, but I also want the flip side of that, which is how are we positively affecting the region? So I think that's something we should really be thinking about.
So the Arctic Council it consists of 8 nations and indigenous people, and there are other nations that have observer status. They traditionally have dealt with issues like the environment. Is that the body through which we should be addressing security concerns? If it isn't, how should we be addressing it? Sherri, do you want to take that?
Well, to the last point, one of our strengths as a nation historically has been, over the last 70 years, our allies and partners. And nowhere is that more true than in the Arctic Council. So for us to undermine that governance structure, which has served us well, is really a lack of leadership and undercutting what is otherwise a strong message. You were very diplomatic in your statement there.
Did you view it as undercutting the council then?
Oh, absolutely. It undercut the council, and it costs our climate leadership. China is now working globally to sort of fill the vacuum left by America's absence on climate leadership in Paris, in the Arctic Council, in other places. Now, is China truly a climate leader? No, I don't believe so. But it is
giving us a verbal cue.
Right, it's feigning that. It's even suggesting that it's Arctic policy, that there will be the shorter shipping routes across the poles will reduce carbon emissions. Okay, so let's be clear what that really means. So I think the Arctic Council is not a security institution. It never has been. It's not NATO. but it has provided a fairly robust governance structure in the region for what it does. And it's enabled, for example, the Coast Guards and their like forces and other parts of government to reach agreement on oil spill prevention, search and rescue, most recently science and technology agreements. And these are all important parts of the fabric that will enable us to work towards continued cooperation in the region and to reduce the prospects for competition or conflict.
So should the mission be expanded to security? And if not, who picks it up?
Well, I think we need to continue to work with our, in the high north, we work with NATO. In other parts of the Arctic, we are increasing our capability to operate there also through our forces in the Pacific that support Alaska Command, and we've increased our partnerships. I don't know that the Arctic Council is the right venue because it includes Russia, and so we can't really convert that forum to a formal security structure, but what we can do is strengthen our security partnerships elsewhere to be able to show presence and deterrence as we need to.
And I think, Jeanne, the 5 NATO members of the 8 Arctic nations can be working on some of these doctrinal things. We created an Arctic Coast Guard Forum a few years back ago to work many of these environmental, search and rescue. I think you're in that security realm. It's a tricky space in there, but I think there is a NATO voice in that, and partner nations like Sweden and Finland that are non-NATO allies, but they're very much partners at the table. I think there's some maneuver space in there.
In the meantime, Liz, are we seeing more cooperation between Russia and China?
So, Russia and China actually have long been partners. You can look back decades and find that they are voting together in the United Nations on issues related to sovereignty. I think more recently, China didn't criticize Russia for its invasion of Crimea. Russia doesn't criticize China for its actions at the South China Sea. Russia has subsumed its idea sort of the Eurasian Economic Corridor, which was its sort of small belt and road through Central Asia within the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think they largely separate the world in some respects. Russia kind of is the more active power, certainly in the security front in the Middle East. China has a lot of Asia. If we're looking at where they're most active, China's in Africa far more than Russia is. So I think they've developed quite a good working relationship. About 6 months ago, Xi Jinping said on TV that President Putin was his best friend in the international community, which I wanted to send a note to President Trump because I knew he'd be crushed because he thinks he's Xi Jinping's best friend. But yeah, so I think they have that good working relationship. Interestingly, and I've only read this, I don't know, so I'd be interested in the thoughts of the other panelists. I have heard that Russia is actually not that excited about China's growing role in the Arctic.
Yeah.
And so this may be an area where actually, sure, there's some cooperation, and China's investing certainly in Russian oil and gas, which is important in a very significant way. It receives most of its oil and gas, the majority of its oil and gas comes from Russia. But I've heard this, so I don't know. But I think it's possible that this may not be the next frontier for strong China-Russia cooperation.
We've heard some of the same things. I think China is about 35% owners in the Yamal energy project. And we talked about the ships transiting through the Bering Sea that come out of the high north there a little bit. That's all tied together. And I've heard the same things, Elizabeth, that there's a little bit of reticence about how deep you want that partnership when Russia's looking to really up their game economically, to up their game in terms of global influence.
Matti, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think the partnership is close in some areas, but I think this might be an area where Russia is not so eager because I think they want to have as much control of the Northern Sea route as possible. I think the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea is a bit unclear what it really means, what kind of status this route has. And I think Russia would like to see control of that because basically they are also responsible for if something happens. And it was mentioned here that it's really a big challenge. We have a big cruise liner in the north. If the closest helicopter one is 1,000 miles away,
right.
And you have 2,000 people on the board, you are in a big trouble.
And in very harsh conditions.
Yes.
Jeanne, we just saw the case off of Norway.
Yeah, and it was close Norway. It was very easy, and it was difficult, and that could have become a really bad case.
And actually, that's one of the things the Chinese want to do is dramatically up Arctic tourism from China. They see that as a very big sort of new economic venture. So we should get ready for that.
Yeah, and they're investing across. I mean, China's investing not only in Russia, which needs its money to develop some of the oil and gas resources, but across the Arctic. They have significant foreign direct investment in Iceland and in Greenland in particular, which is not only a quest for the resources, but some say also a quest for greater global influence.
You know, we haven't touched on Russia's territorial claims. We may all remember them planting a flag under the sea ice a few years ago. Now they're claiming the northern sea route as their own. How much concern is there over their effort to establish this large footprint?
Well, I think we need to distinguish the claims which can legitimately be made through the Law of the Sea Convention for the subsurface mining rights, which each nation is asserting, and there is a process, from the way the surface waters are understood. Russia interprets the northern sea route along its coastline as internal waters and wants to require an escort, essentially a toll-based system for vessels to transit it so it can make money on it. Now, China objects to that. Interestingly, China wants to declare it international waters, unlike its conflicting position in the South China Sea, where they say that's their internal waters, okay? Now, the U.S. and Secretary Pompeo called out not only Russia for its view of internal waters at his statement at around the last Arctic Council meeting, but he also called out our close ally Canada, which also interprets the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic waters as internal waters. Now, the U.S. doesn't agree with that position, but we've long agreed with our very close and important Canadian ally to agree to disagree at this point. We wouldn't necessarily ask permission if we were doing a military transit, but we would notify them. Okay, so you know, I think that we're going to have to manage this, and these issues are going to become more apparent and more real should we attempt in the future, when we have that nuclear ice-breaking capability, to conduct a freedom of navigation maneuver in that region.
Can I just ask one question, which may sound nonsensical, but if the Arctic is warming so dramatically, are we going to need icebreakers 20 years from now?
So I would argue, Jeanne, the Arctic, I'm going to stay out of the science. Let's mark people like Sherri and the scientists talk about that. There's clearly more access for longer times of the year, but then there's more disaggregate. There's actually an increased demand for icebreaking services in the coming years. And because of the projected interests of a Russia militaristically, economically, of a China, we absolutely need those ships. You know, I've talked about a 6-3-1 strategy. It was about a minimum of 6 breakers, 3 heavy, what we call polar security cutters. We mentioned the good news, awarding one in April. We have a strong support, bipartisan, bicameral, to start to build some icebreakers now. The White House is supportive, so I think we're on the right trajectory there. The one was getting going. We've been talking about this for my 3 predecessors, so we're in a good spot, but you can't play catch-up ball. And go back to that China building ships faster than we do. They just built an icebreaker, so they got some recency. It's a different kind of steel work and stuff, so we're in a catch-up game, but I think we're turning the corner on having the right conversations as a nation about projecting capacity up there.
Yeah, I agree. Paradoxically, the more the Arctic region is warming up, the more we are going to use the region, and the more we are going to use icebreakers as well. At the moment, it was mentioned this big LNG project, which became ready 2 years ago, and now is full steam, producing 16 million tons of LNG. That is transported during the summer half of the year, around 6 months, through the Bering Strait to the Asian markets, and then rest of the year to the European or even US markets. So, you know, there will be quite a lot of, warming to go before that can be, first of all year round. And these are kind of huge vessels, and they can go in a 1.5 meter ice without icebreaker help. So, you know, that kind of technological needs are there for a very long, long time, because in winter it will be really tough in 20 years' time as well.
Speaking of the conditions there, you've mentioned the possibility of conflict there. Others have as well. In those harsh conditions, would that really be the place where conflict is likely to break out? Wouldn't the cold be as big an enemy as another superpower?
You know, Jeanne, when I speak of conflict, competition, I'm not sure we speak about kinetic conflict, competition, right? I think, you know, could you play that out? You know, there's talk about what type of armament the Russians are putting board. I get the question as we're just getting about the award in this first break, or what kind of weapons are you putting it on? I said, no, the conversation today still is about a peaceful, secure, cooperative Arctic, but we building the capabilities to have those conversations down the road. So, yeah, I think your question is an informed question. I don't have a great answer for it. I don't think we're talking about potential combat in the Arctic, but we have to be prepared for it. I mean, the deployment of NATO forces above the Arctic Circle. We're doing an exercise here with the 3rd Fleet, the Expeditionary Strike Group 3, with a Special Purpose Marine Air Ground Task Force, Northcom Coast Guard supported it here in September, an expeditionary, probably a amphibious landing in ADAC. You're going to test the Joint Logistics System. You know, we're looking at our own capabilities. So I would say we are planning for all contingencies, but I don't think that's where we're hoping to steer this thing.
I think we need to think about aggression that could be short of actual armed conflict.
Right.
We weren't prepared for the Russian incursions in Ukraine and Crimea. Now we talk about hybrid warfare and little green men. What's that going to look like? What could that look like in Russia? Svalbard, for example, which is a part of Norway but has a unique international status and has researchers from many countries around the world, including many Chinese and Russians, as well as many others. Some have talked about, is that more susceptible to influence in the future? Russia has increased its air presence in the high north, buzzed our allies in the region more aggressively in recent years, even though it's not at the level of the Cold War activity yet. So I think we have to be, you know, we just should beware of a failure of imagination when it comes to thinking about the situations that could arise in this region.
It is time to take some audience questions. I have a couple of hands went right up right here in the front. Could we bring a mic down to this gentleman in the blue shirt? And if you could give us your name, your affiliation, and then give us your question. Here it is.
My name is Clancy Herbst, is this on? And I've circumnavigated the Earth by sea on the north end of the Earth, both the Northwest Passage, Northeast. 2 things or 3 things about territorial waters that I'd like you to speak to. There's a bunch of islands north of Russia. It's a long coastline, and they're very big islands. There's some small ones. They've populated, all the big islands have 3 citizens on each island. They're there 12 months a year and have been there for decades in the dark in the wintertime. The other thing is that what we learned about the sea is that it is quite shallow north of Russia, and therefore the concept of big oil tankers and 5,000 people on a cruise ship isn't too logical. You won't want to go there. But how do you, with Russia having citizens on all those islands, what are their claim for territorial waters? And you better stay out.
Okay, and before we get that answer, I want to know the circumstances that led you to take that trip.
I'm half crazy.
Did you do this as a private citizen? Or?
Yes, I did. It's very interesting. It's 5 weeks by sea from Murmansk to Alaska.
Wow.
Very impressive.
Hats off to you. So, territorial waters questions.
So I would say take the first stab at that, and I suspect Sherri may want to weigh in or Liz, but clearly there's international convention on how we determine territorial jurisdiction. Those go back to The Hague for adjudication when there's disagreements. I'm really curious what the other half is. The crazy half I get. I'm not sure what the other half is that gets you to do that, as a private citizen. But you mentioned the shallow waters. Maersk, the large shipping company, the Maersk Venta, actually has made a transit just this past year with containers through the Northern Sea route. So there is limitations on water depth, but there are routes that enable it to do that in these large cruise ships. So I think there is clearly a pattern. Maersk tells us that's not in the immediate tomorrow, it's years down the road. But I think back to the territorial sea claims, we're cognizant of that. Russia, if they're legitimate, recognized Russian islands, they have this international 12-mile claims. The EEZ claims extend out. There's places where confined straits, you draw the baseline in the middle. So there's international ways to recognize that, and I think that can all be sort of reasonably adjudicated. There'll be contentious areas, as we see in the South China Sea. There's a disputed spot in Canada, like Jeanne talked about, but there is mechanisms to have adult conversations about that.
We had another question at the same table. I'm sorry, this gentleman in the white, if we could bring the mic down one more time. It's hard to navigate, almost as hard as the Arctic.
Murmansk.
No
Thank you.
icebergs there.
I'm going on that trip next week. So, there's a treaty among surrounding countries of the Antarctic, which basically has, as I understand it, protected the Antarctic from commercial and military, et cetera. I'm sort of interested in whether or not there's any possibility that model of treaty, even if as opposed to what's already happened, going forward, you limit the economic, military, and other forms of interaction with the Arctic, in that way trying to prevent the potential conflict that exists.
Possible?
Well, you have to recognize that the Antarctica is a large landmass, and so we agreed, to make that a military, free zone and not owned by any one nation, which is, you have quite the opposite in the Arctic. You've got an ocean with, countries with sovereignty surrounding it.
But the fishing rights down there, it's all protected, so they can take toothfish, which is what the equivalent of I can't remember what it is, but apparently they prevent harvesting fish beyond what they view as preserving.
Sustainable.
Yes, sustainable fishing, and we have some marine protected areas now, for example, in the Ross Sea, and there's active discussions in the UN and other fora about increasing the number of marine protected areas around Antarctica, and even now potentially on the high seas. There's, that might be possible in the future in the Arctic, but I think it's going to protect, we have that one fishing moratorium right now for the next 16 years, but a marine protected area would provide even further protection, and I'm not sure how possible that will be in the near future.
And I think exacerbating this is we have a national strategy, a national defense strategy that talks about competing powers. I think if you go back and look at when that treaty was stroked, the politics were a little bit different here geostrategically too a little bit. So it's not out of the realm of the possible. If you had the 8 Arctic nations at the table trying to come up with some type of agreement, where does China fit into that equation? Elizabeth, you probably got a better perspective than I do on that. But.
No, I think China would be glad to be invited to the table, because anything that actually recognizes China somehow equal and on par with the other 8 Arctic nations, they'd be all for it. And again, they did sign this prohibition already. So I think it's possible, but I think you do need a different set of leadership, certainly than we've got right now.
And I don't know, do you want to legitimize China's NearArctic nation claim? That's what you got to figure out a little bit,
We have another question here, I think. Was your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to ask kind of almost like a poll of the board here, but what would drive us to legitimize that claim? And in that case, is that not kind of a runaway train story?
Would it?
Legitimize China's claim, you mean?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a NearArctic claim could down the road, if we kind of have a perspective of appeasement on near anything claims by any nation state, where does that lead us?
Right. Well, again, I think China's trying to redefine the nature of the Arctic issue, right? So that it along with others, becomes a claimant with equal standing, so that the Arctic, nations are not as relevant. So I think it's actually trying to do that right now. I think the one possible advantage would be that, China is a permanent observer, right? There are also how many others? 13, 14, something. So once China comes into this, I think many other nations then also come in, and you really do get a fundamental transformation of Arctic governance, and that would be a different ballgame, which might actually be fine with the United States because it might bring in many more allies, like Japan, for example. I don't play in that space completely, but my feeling is that until we have a strategy, the last thing we should be doing is opening the door to, the wolf. Right?
And we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, One Belt, One Road, Polar Silk Road. Is that economic? Is that strategic positioning for all? It's all the above. But I think you have to really, your question, you got to go down that rabbit hole and think about how that plays on many different factors, because there's a lot there behind that question.
And when we talk about the kind of governance of the Arctic region, I think it's important that the Arctic Council countries take real responsibility.
Right.
If they cannot solve the problems, then you have others, chipping in and trying to, participate in this process. So it would be very important that, these 8 countries would find a consensus and solve these things, which are the challenges for all of us.
And let me compliment Finland here, which just finished its term as chair of the Arctic Council, taking the Arctic Council through some very challenging couple of years, but continuing to push forward on important agreements on improving communications and environmental protection and other important areas in the region.
And now the Icelanders are in the chair, and for them, important thing will be the plastic in the oceans.
Ocean plastics.
So, that's important that we are tackling those questions which are relevant for all of us.
We have another question back here, I think, the back table.
Thank you. Stephen Shapiro of the Atlantic Council. And I've just returned from Norway, in fact, on a fact finder meeting with MODs and the commander of the Norwegian fleet, et cetera. And apropos of Ms. Goodman's comment or observation of the maxim that strategy without resources is ephemeral, strategy without a strategy is just nuts. We have no strategy, and I'm perhaps the Commandant or Sherri yourself, having been at DOD, could tell us what, in fact, is the United States Arctic strategy, whether it's a military strategic strategy or an economic strategy. I'll tell you that the Norwegians were complaining up a storm that NATO doesn't have an Arctic strategy. So this whole idea of Trident Juncture being an Arctic exercise is no disrespect to those who went through it, and thank goodness that they did it, but it demonstrated that the Germans don't like cold, logistics don't really work up there, comms were down. I mean, it wasn't a big success, and I see Finland smiling, but it wasn't a big success. Although it went all the way to Rovaniemi, so congratulations on that. But the punchline is back to U.S. policy. Why don't we, and what, is there any policy at all other than reactive and let's build a ship and see what happens and complain a lot?
Steve, let me take a
beyond
stab.
that, I don't know where we are.
Steve, I'll tell you, I rolled out an Arctic strategic outlook in April, ahead of knowing that the Department of Defense was going to roll out their Arctic strategy. Just came out in recent weeks, ahead of knowing the National Security Council is working on a Arctic strategy. When we rolled out our strategy, we had rolled out a previous strategy 5 years plus ago, 6 years ago in 2013. It was an Arctic strategy. We've sort of reframed how we're approaching, we call them strategic outlooks under a Coast Guard 4-year strategy now. But our strategy has 3 lines of effort. It's enhancing our capabilities to operate in a very dynamic Arctic environment. It's about strengthening the rule-based order, and it's innovate and adapt for the resilience and prosperity of the Arctic. I think if you look at the Department of Defense Arctic strategy just came out, our strategy and that are very complementary, not by accident, but by close collaboration. We've been involved and at the table with the National Security Council as they're working on a national strategy. So I think Yes, we are shooting behind the target. You're absolutely correct. That's a fair statement. I think we are doing some backfill. I made the comment, Russia's worldview is absolutely centric on the Arctic. You know, for most Americans in our society, the Arctic is just a distant place with no real interest. So it has not been an easy place. We've pushed a big rock uphill. I think we're at a turning point. I think the Chinese presence in the Arctic has really been helpful to up the game a little bit. You know, Sherri's comment about Secretary Mattis, you know, being in Alaska, looking, saying we got to up our game in the Arctic. The second part of that was in the Coast Guard is a key part of that. I made a note of that, and I use that quite a bit. But you're absolutely correct. But I think we're on a better trajectory here in 2019 than we have been.
Sir, wait for the microphone here so we can all hear you.
Is the fact that the Coast Guard is the lead agency there as opposed to the Navy, is that telling at all? Does that demonstrate that we really haven't put a strategic gloss on the Arctic yet? No disrespect to the Coast Guard, which, by the way, is my favorite agency. So I'm just saying. So it's my favorite service.
No, I think, Steve, I'd say this.
But that's a real question.
I think we have a 150-year history operating in the Arctic. I've gone to the Arctic with Secretary Spencer, who's now our acting Secretary of Defense. I've talked to the CNO on this. DOD is keenly interested. The Navy's interested in the Arctic. We also have to look at what's going on across the globe. You know, the Navy has high demands in the South China Sea. We're looking at a much more aggressive situation in the Mediterranean. We are looking at drawing down forces in the Arabian Gulf and the NAV-CENTCOM region, and recent weeks' events have sort of shown us that that may not unfold the same way. So I think Coast Guard, lead agency in the Arctic right now, that sounds okay and about right to me. We've got to build these polar capable ships, but the Navy will absolutely, this contract we awarded in April was done through a joint Coast Guard Navy integrated program office. The Navy actually awarded the contract. So we are linked up and working very diligently and collaboratively with the United States Navy and the Department of Defense on the Arctic moving forward.
We've been talking some about weather forecasts. I want each of you to make a bit of a geopolitical forecast for me. So we're having this conversation. I think it may be one of the first times the Aspen Security Forum has tackled the Arctic. If we were going to have this conversation in 5 years, 10 years, how's the conversation going to be different? Liz, why don't we start with you?
Well, instead of Finnish representative, we'd have a Chinese representative on the dais. That's my prediction. 10 years, China will have reconfigured Arctic governance.
I would say in 5 years, I'm hoping we'll have one, probably two polar security, very capable vessels. So we'll be doing the McMurdo mission, which is absolutely essential to our national interests, but we will have an enhanced presence. We'll know more about the Arctic. I hope we'll have solved this communications domain awareness problem in 5 years in the Arctic. So when we are there, you know, our presence equals influence, and it's meaningful influence in looking out for our sovereign interests.
Sherri?
Okay, well, part of the domain awareness for the Arctic is also what you just, weather prediction and increasingly extended weather, or what some call near-term climate. Now, nowhere is that more needed than in the Arctic. I mean, it's needed globally. Right now, we have a National Weather Service. We don't have a climate service. The private sector is now starting to develop those climate services, near-term weather, extended weather prediction. That's going to come in the Arctic. The question is whether the Chinese or others will develop that capability before us.
And what will it mean if the Chinese develop it?
That they're better able to operate because they're going to have more insight into how to deploy, whether it's military assets or ships or other capability in the region.
So it makes it more likely that Liz's prediction is going to come through. Matti, last to you. What do you think we'll be talking about and looking at in 5 or 10 years?
I think it's quite clear that there will be much more economic activity in the region, and that will lead to more needs for doing things also from the government side. And hopefully the Arctic Council countries are able to tackle these challenges.
Without China, no.
And we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank my panelists for their wonderful participation. Matti Anttonen, Sherri Goodman, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Schultz, and also Liz Economy. Thanks so much for joining us.
There is now a half-hour break before the next event at the Greenwald Pavilion. If you'd like to get a good seat, head over that way across campus to the Greenwald Pavilion.